He was still breathing, but already marked as a dog no one should ever take home. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And if you believe no soul deserves to be forgotten in a cold room, stay with me, because this one doesn't end the way anyone expected. The shelter smelled like bleach and rust, the kind of smell that clings to your throat long after you leave. And under the flickering fluorescent lights, rows of metal kennels stretched like quiet confessions no one wanted to hear. Some dogs barked, desperate and loud. Others whimpered softly into the corners of their cages. But in the far end of the room, past the noise and the movement and the hope that still flickered in the others, there was one kennel that stayed completely still. No sound, no movement, just a single dog lying against the cold concrete floor, his breathing slow, steady, almost like he had already accepted something the others were still fighting against. His name, printed on a fading card clipped to the cage, read, Rex. Beneath it, in bold red marker, someone had written words that made people hesitate before even stepping closer. Retired K9. Not suitable for adoption. People walked past him all day. Families with kids stopped at the louder dogs, the playful ones, the ones that wagged their tails and pressed their noses against the bars like they still believed in second chances. But Rex didn't move. He didn't lift his head. He didn't try to make eye contact. It wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was something quieter, something heavier. Like a soldier standing at the end of a war no one remembered he fought. His coat, once a proud blend of black and tan, had dulled with time, patches worn thin where the years had pressed hardest against him, and his eyes, deep, amber, watchful, didn't follow people the way most dogs did. They stayed fixed, distant, as if they were still looking at something far beyond the walls of that shelter. The staff didn't talk about him much. They didn't need to. Everyone knew the story in pieces. A police dog, years of service. A partner he had worked beside through nights that smelled of rain and asphalt and something darker beneath it. And then one day, retirement. Papers signed. A collar left on. A transfer made. And after that, silence. No one came for him. No handler. No family. No explanation. Just a quiet arrival and a label that told the world everything it needed to know to walk away. By mid-afternoon, the shelter had grown busier, footsteps echoing across the concrete, voices blending into a low hum of decisions being made and lives being changed in small, hopeful ways. A young couple stopped 2 kennels down from Rex, laughing as a puppy tumbled over its own paws, and for a moment, the sound carried across the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. But it never reached him. Rex didn't react. Not to the laughter. Not to the footsteps. Not even to the sharp clang of a kennel door closing somewhere down the row. He just lay there, breathing, waiting, or maybe not waiting at all. And then the front door opened again. The cold air slipped in first, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and city streets, followed by a man who didn't look like he belonged there to adopt anything. Officer Daniel Hayes stepped inside with the quiet presence of someone used to being unnoticed when it mattered most. Mid-30s, broad-shouldered, his uniform still crisp from a long shift, a small tattoo visible along his right forearm. Inked lines forming the shape of a shepherd's head, subtle, almost hidden unless you were looking for it. He wasn't there for a dog. Not really. He had paperwork to drop off. A quick visit. In and out. That's what he told himself as he nodded to the front desk and walked past the rows of kennels without slowing down. But something shifted as he moved deeper into the room. Not a sound. Not a call. Just a feeling, the kind that settles in your chest before your mind can explain it. He slowed his steps, turned his head slightly, and for the first time that day, Rex moved. Not much. Just enough. His eyes lifted, slow, deliberate, and locked onto Daniel with a stillness that didn't ask for anything, didn't beg, didn't hope, just recognized. Like 2 stories crossing paths that had already been written long before this moment. Daniel stopped. He didn't know why. There were louder dogs, friendlier dogs, easier choices standing just a few feet away. But none of them held his attention the way this one did. Because there was something in those eyes that didn't match the sign on the cage. Something that didn't belong to a dog no one wanted. Something unfinished. He stepped closer, boots echoing softly against the floor, and for the first time, he noticed the collar. Old leather. Worn. Scratched. Still fastened around Rex's neck like it had never been meant to come off. Most retired K9s had theirs removed. It was part of the process. Clean break. Clean ending. But this one was still there. And for reasons Daniel couldn't yet explain, that bothered him more than anything else in the room. Daniel did not reach for the latch right away. He stood there, close enough now to hear the quiet rhythm of the dog's breathing, steady but heavy, like something carrying more than just the weight of years. Up close, the details became clearer. The faint scars along Rex's muzzle. The slight wear in his front paws, the kind that came from long hours on asphalt and concrete, not grass or backyard fences. This was not a dog that had lived an easy life and simply grown old. This was a dog that had worked, that had endured, that had stayed long after others would have stepped back. Daniel lowered himself slowly, crouching just outside the kennel, careful, not because he feared the dog, but because something about the moment felt like it required respect. Rex did not move. His eyes remained fixed on Daniel, unblinking, calm, almost as if he had been waiting for this exact distance, this exact moment. "Hey," Daniel said quietly, his voice low, steady, the way you speak when you are not trying to command, only to be understood. The word hung in the air between them, simple and unforced. No reaction, no shift in posture. But the silence did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, like a pause before something important. Daniel exhaled slowly and let his gaze drift again to the collar. The leather was darker near the edges, worn from years of use, small cracks running along the surface like fine lines on weathered hands. There was a metal plate attached, not the kind you would find on a standard tag, but something more deliberate, something that had been placed there with intention. Most people would not notice it. Most had not. But Daniel's eyes lingered. He reached out, stopping just short of the bars, giving the dog space to refuse if he wanted to. Rex did not pull away. That alone was enough. Carefully, Daniel slid his fingers through the gap and touched the edge of the collar, feeling the rough texture beneath his hand. It was colder than he expected. He turned it slightly, just enough for the light to catch the engraving. At first, it did not make sense. The letters were faint, worn down by time, but still there. Someone had taken the time to carve them deep once. Deep enough to last. Daniel leaned in closer, his brow tightening as he read it again, slower this time, making sure he was not imagining what he thought he saw. He did not betray us. The words sat there, simple, quiet, and yet they carried a weight that did not belong in a shelter kennel. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, subtle but undeniable, like a memory brushing past without fully revealing itself. He glanced back at Rex, searching for some reaction, some sign that the words meant something to the dog as well. Rex did not move, but his eyes, they held steady, focused, as if confirming something Daniel had not yet fully understood. Below the sentence, there was more. Smaller text, harder to read. Daniel adjusted his angle, letting the overhead light fall just right across the metal. A name, and beneath it, a number. Not a phone number, not a registration code. Something else. Something official. Daniel's mind moved quickly now, instincts pulling pieces together before logic could catch up. The name stirred something familiar, like a file he had glanced at months ago, a briefing he had not thought about since. A case that had closed too quickly, a conclusion that had never quite settled right. He pulled his hand back slowly, his fingers lingering for a moment before leaving the collar, as if letting go of something more than just leather and metal. The shelter noise returned around him, distant at first, then clearer. A dog barking. Somewhere down the row. A door opening. Voices near the front desk. But Daniel did not move. He stayed there, crouched in front of the kennel, staring at Rex with a new kind of attention, one that no longer saw a retired dog, or a warning label, or a forgotten file. He saw a question, and maybe, an answer that had been waiting longer than anyone realized. "Who were you with?" he murmured, almost to himself. Rex's ears twitched, just slightly, the smallest movement so far, but enough to send a quiet certainty through Daniel's thoughts. This was not random. This was not a mistake. And whatever had been written on that collar, it had not been meant to disappear in a place like this. Daniel stood slowly, his knees protesting after the crouch, but his focus never leaving the dog. Around him, life in the shelter continued the same as before, unchanged, unaware. But for Daniel, something had shifted. He walked to the front desk, his steps measured, controlled, though his mind was already moving ahead, retracing fragments, pulling at threads that had not made sense before. The clerk looked up, offering a polite smile. "Find someone you like?" she asked casually, glancing toward the kennels. Daniel paused, just long enough to choose his words. "That dog in the last row," he said, keeping his tone even. "Rex, where did he come from?" The clerk hesitated, her smile fading slightly as she glanced toward a clipboard. "Transfer," she said. "Couple weeks ago. No family listed. Just paperwork." She shrugged lightly, as if that explained everything. For most people, it would have. Daniel nodded slowly, but his eyes had already hardened with something deeper than curiosity. He looked back once more toward the far kennel, where Rex still lay exactly as before, still watching, still waiting. Not for rescue, not for kindness, but for something else entirely. Something that had not been finished. Daniel did not leave right away. The clipboard on the counter sat untouched beneath his hand, the paperwork he had come to drop off suddenly feeling smaller than it had 10 minutes ago, like it belonged to a different version of him that had not yet seen the dog at the end of the row. The clerk had already moved on, answering another question, her voice blending into the background noise of the shelter, but Daniel remained still, his thoughts circling back to the engraving on that worn piece of metal. "He did not betray us." The sentence repeated in his mind, not loud, not urgent, just steady, like a truth that had been waiting too long to be heard. The name beneath it pressed harder now, pushing through the fog of memory. He had seen it before, not in passing, not casually. It had been part of something bigger, something unfinished. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering for a moment before he unlocked it. He did not search the internet. He did not type the name into a browser. Instead, he opened an internal database, one that most people never had access to, and entered the number exactly as it had been etched on the collar. For a second, nothing happened. Then the screen shifted. A file appeared. Restricted. Archived. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Archived did not mean solved. It meant closed. Sometimes too early. He tapped it anyway. The details loaded slowly, line by line, like the system itself was reluctant to bring it back. Officer Michael Donnelly. Canine Handler. Unit designation. Years of service. Commendations listed in careful order. And then, the final entry. Investigation concluded. Suspected internal breach. Case closed. Daniel felt a quiet tension settle into his shoulders. Suspected. Not proven. The kind of word that lived in reports when certainty was missing but decisions had to be made anyway. He scrolled further. There was no mention of a dog being transferred. No follow-up. No closure that felt complete. Just an ending that had been written without all the pieces in place. Daniel lowered the phone slowly, his eyes lifting toward the kennels again. From where he stood, he could just see the far corner where Rex lay, still in the same position, still as unmoving as before, but now the stillness meant something different. This was not a dog that had been left behind because he was difficult or broken. This was a dog that had carried something out of that case, and no one had asked him what it was. Daniel walked back toward the kennel, slower this time, more deliberate, as if each step needed to match the weight of what he was beginning to understand. The noise of the shelter faded again as he approached, replaced by that same quiet pocket of space that seemed to exist only around Rex. He stopped in front of the bars and looked down at him, not as a stranger now, but as someone standing at the edge of a story that had never been told correctly. "Michael Donnelly," Daniel said softly, testing the name out loud. Rex's ears shifted again, a small movement, but sharper this time, more certain. Not confusion. Recognition. Daniel let out a slow breath, the confirmation settling deeper than any file ever could. "They said he turned." Daniel continued, his voice low, steady, more to himself than to the dog. "They said he walked away from his unit." The words felt wrong even as he said them, like repeating a sentence that did not belong to the truth. Rex's gaze did not waver. If anything, it sharpened, the amber in his eyes catching the light just enough to reflect something stronger than silence. Daniel crouched again, closer this time. No hesitation now as he reached toward the latch. His fingers paused for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but out of understanding. This was not just opening a kennel. This was stepping into something that had been waiting for him to notice. He opened it slowly. The metal door creaked softly, the sound cutting through the quiet space between them. Rex did not lunge. He did not retreat. He simply remained where he was, watching, measuring, as if deciding something of his own. Daniel rested his hand lightly against the edge of the open door. "I do not think you were left here by accident," he said. The words felt simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Rex blinked once. Slow, deliberate. The first real movement that felt like an answer. Not obedience. Not training. Choice. Daniel shifted slightly, giving the dog space. Not pulling. Not calling. Just waiting. Seconds passed. Then Rex moved. It was not dramatic. Not sudden. He rose carefully, his joints stiff from hours on the concrete, and stepped forward one pace at a time until he stood just inside the open door. Close enough to leave. Close enough to stay. His head lifted slightly, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. There was no excitement in him. No relief. Just purpose. The kind that does not fade with time. Daniel understood then, in a way that did not need explanation. This dog had not been waiting for a home. He had been waiting for someone to listen. And whatever truth had been buried in that file, whatever had been written off and sealed away, it had never left. It had been carried, quietly, patiently, right here, on a worn collar that no one else had thought to read. The hallway outside the kennels felt different as Daniel stepped back. Not louder, not quieter, just heavier, like the air itself had shifted to make room for something that had been set in motion. Rex stood just behind him now, not touching, not crowding, but close enough that Daniel could hear the faint rhythm of his steps matching his own as they moved toward the front desk. No leash, no command, just a quiet agreement neither of them had spoken out loud. The clerk looked up again, her expression changing slightly when she noticed the open kennel behind them. "Sir," she said, a hint of concern in her voice, "that dog is not cleared for." Daniel raised a hand gently, not to silence her, but to slow the moment. "I am not taking him home," he said, his tone calm, measured, but firm in a way that made it clear he was not guessing anymore. "I need his transfer records. All of them." The clerk hesitated, her eyes flicking from Daniel to Rex, then back again. "There is not much," she admitted. "Just intake paperwork." He was flagged as difficult. The word lingered awkwardly, like it did not quite fit the dog standing a few feet away without a single sign of agitation. Daniel nodded once. Printed anyway. Minutes later, a thin stack of papers rested in his hand, lighter than it should have been for something that had carried this much consequence. He flipped through them quickly. Dates. Signatures. A transport log. No handler listed. No follow-up. No explanation for why a decorated K9 had ended up here with a label that discouraged anyone from asking questions. Daniel exhaled slowly, folding the papers in half and slipping them into his jacket. "I will sign him out," he said. The clerk blinked. "Sign him out. Temporary custody," Daniel clarified. "Official capacity." It was not entirely a lie. Not entirely the truth either. But it was enough. The clerk studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, reaching for another form. "You are responsible for him," she said quietly. "He is not adjusted well." Daniel glanced down at Rex, who stood still, composed, his posture steady as if he had heard every word and dismissed it without reaction. "He is not the problem," Daniel replied. The paperwork was quick. A signature, a timestamp, a brief instruction about feeding schedules and contact numbers that Daniel barely registered. And then the final sound, a soft click as the shelter door opened. Outside, the air felt different. Cooler, cleaner. The faint scent of rain lingered on the pavement, mixing with the distant hum of traffic and the low glow of streetlights beginning to flicker on as the evening settled in. Rex paused just beyond the doorway, his nose lifting slightly, drawing in the air as if measuring the world beyond the shelter walls. Not excitement, not hesitation, recognition. Daniel waited, giving him the space to choose again. After a second, Rex stepped forward. The decision made. They walked side by side across the parking lot, Daniel's boots echoing softly against the asphalt, Rex's paws silent by comparison, steady and precise, each step placed with intention. At the patrol car, Daniel opened the passenger side rear door, stepping back slightly. "Up," he said, not as a command, but as an invitation. Rex looked at the vehicle, then back at Daniel, holding his gaze for a brief moment before stepping in smoothly, settling without hesitation onto the seat as if he had done it 100 times before. Muscle memory. Training that never leaves. Daniel closed the door gently and walked around to the driver's side, sliding into the seat with a quiet exhale. For a moment, he did not start the engine. He just sat there, hands resting lightly on the wheel, the dashboard lights casting a soft glow across the interior. In the rearview mirror, Rex's eyes met his again. Still calm, still watching. Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone once more, reopening the file. Officer Michael Donnelly. The name no longer felt distant. It felt present, immediate. He scrolled through the report again, slower this time, looking for what had been missed instead of what had been written. And there it was, a small note buried near the end. Location reference. Coordinates tied to the final day of the investigation. Daniel's thumb hovered over the screen, then tapped once, bringing up the map. The point appeared just outside the city limits. An industrial area. Quiet. Overlooked. The kind of place that did not attract attention unless you were already looking for it. Daniel glanced back again. You remember it, he said softly. It was not a question. Rex's ears shifted slightly, his posture straightening just a fraction, the smallest signal, but clear enough. Daniel nodded once, as if that settled something unspoken between them. He turned the key. The engine started with a low hum, steady and familiar. As the car pulled out of the lot, the shelter faded behind them, its lights growing smaller in the rearview mirror until they disappeared entirely. Ahead, the road stretched out under the dim glow of street lamps, leading toward a place that had been written off, filed away, forgotten by everyone except the one witness who had never left it behind. And now, he was not alone anymore. The city lights thinned out mile by mile, fading into longer stretches of dark road where the hum of the engine became the only steady sound inside the patrol car. Street lamps grew farther apart, their glow softer, more uncertain, until they gave way to open stretches where the night pressed in closer, heavier, like it was waiting to see what would unfold next. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly near the console, his eyes moving between the road ahead and the faint reflection in the rearview mirror where Rex sat, still as ever, watching not the passing scenery, but him. Not once since they had left the shelter had the dog shifted restlessly or shown any sign of confusion. No pacing, no anxiety, just that same quiet focus, like he knew exactly where they were going long before Daniel had entered the coordinates. The map on the dashboard screen showed the route clearly now. 12 miles outside the city. A turnoff leading into an older industrial zone that had long since slowed down. Warehouses sitting idle, lots left unused, places where things were stored, forgotten, or simply left alone. Daniel had driven past areas like that before without a second thought. Tonight, it felt different. He adjusted his grip on the wheel slightly, his jaw tightening as the memory continued to piece itself together. Officer Michael Donnelly, a respected handler, years of service without incident. And then suddenly, a case that closed with questions instead of answers. A suspicion that had never been proven. A reputation left hanging somewhere between respect and doubt. Daniel had not known Donnelly personally, but in his line of work, names like that carried weight. And now that name was etched into a collar that had survived longer than the truth it was meant to protect. The road curved gently to the right, and Daniel slowed the car as the GPS signaled an upcoming turn. Gravel replaced pavement beneath the tires, the sound shifting instantly, louder, rougher, each movement of the vehicle echoing slightly in the quiet surroundings. The headlights stretched out ahead, cutting through the darkness and revealing a narrow path lined with overgrown weeds and rusted fencing that leaned just enough to suggest it had not been maintained in years. Daniel did not speak. He did not need to. Behind him, Rex had already shifted forward slightly, not standing, not moving toward the door, just leaning enough that his posture changed from passive to alert. The signal was small, but unmistakable. They were close. The car rolled to a slow stop about 50 feet from what remained of an old warehouse structure, its outline barely visible against the night sky. The building stood quiet, windows dark, the metal siding worn and dull, as if time itself had decided to leave it behind. Daniel turned off the engine, and, for a moment, everything went still. No hum, no movement, just the faint ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of wind brushing against loose debris somewhere beyond the fence line. He sat there for a second, letting the silence settle, then reached back and opened the rear door. Rex did not jump out immediately. He stepped down with the same measured calm he had shown all evening, his paws landing softly on the gravel, his head lifting just slightly as he scanned the area. Not searching, remembering. Daniel closed the door quietly and stood beside the car, his eyes following the dog's movements as Rex took a few slow steps forward, then paused, looking toward the warehouse before glancing back at Daniel. It was not a command. It was not hesitation. It was confirmation. Daniel nodded once. "All right," he said softly. Together, they moved toward the structure, their footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness. As they approached, the details became clearer. A side entrance partially ajar. A strip of faded caution tape fluttering lightly in the breeze, its color dulled by time. The kind of place that had once been part of something official, then quietly abandoned when the paperwork said it was no longer needed. Rex stopped just a few feet from the doorway. His body stilled completely, his ears forward, his gaze fixed on the space beyond the opening. Daniel felt it then, that same subtle shift he had sensed back at the shelter, but stronger now, more defined. Not danger, not fear, just significance, like standing at the edge of a memory that had never been fully closed. "This is it," Daniel murmured. Rex did not move, but his presence seemed to press forward, urging without pushing. Daniel stepped past him and gently pushed the door open further. It creaked softly, the sound echoing inside the empty structure. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping slowly across the interior. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by the movement, tiny particles catching the light like fragments of something long settled. Old equipment sat pushed to the sides, crates stacked unevenly. Nothing immediately remarkable, nothing that would explain why this place mattered. Daniel took a few steps inside, his senses sharpening, his focus narrowing as he scanned each corner. Behind him, Rex entered quietly, his steps deliberate, his head low, not in fear, but in concentration. Then, without warning, Rex stopped again. This time, he turned slightly to the left and sat. Not randomly, not out of fatigue. Precisely, Daniel followed the movement, angling the flashlight in that direction. At first, there was nothing, just a section of the floor that looked no different than the rest. But then he noticed it. A faint marking. Subtle. Easy to miss unless you were looking closely. A small, worn outline where something had once rested or been placed, long enough to leave an impression that time had not fully erased. Daniel stepped closer, his pulse steady but focused now, every detail sharpening in his mind. He crouched down slowly, the beam of light narrowing as he examined the spot. Rex remained behind him, still seated, watching, waiting, not for instruction, for recognition. And in that quiet, dim space, Daniel understood something that had not been written in any report. This was where the story had changed. This was where the truth had been left behind. And for years, the only one who remembered it had been the dog sitting just a few feet away. Daniel did not touch the floor right away. He stayed crouched, the beam of his flashlight steady over the faint outline, letting his eyes adjust not just to what he was seeing, but to what he might have missed if he rushed. Dust had settled evenly across most of the warehouse, a thin gray layer that softened edges and blurred time. But here, it was different. The surface carried a subtle interruption, a shape that had once been occupied, something that had waited, something that had remained long enough to leave a memory behind. He shifted slightly, angling the light to catch the edges more clearly. Rectangular, about 2 feet wide, maybe 3 feet long. Not random, not accidental. Deliberate placement. Behind him, Rex remained seated, his posture unchanged, but his presence felt closer now, like the distance between them had narrowed without either of them moving. Daniel reached out slowly, brushing his fingers lightly across the surface. The dust gave way easily, revealing a cleaner layer beneath, protected until now. He traced the outline once more, his mind already working through possibilities. Evidence storage, equipment crate, or something else entirely. Something that had been removed, but not forgotten. "You stayed here," Daniel murmured quietly, more to the dog than to himself. Rex did not respond with movement, but the stillness held a kind of confirmation that did not need sound. Daniel shifted his weight and stood, sweeping the flashlight slowly across the surrounding area, widening the circle of light inch by inch. Old shelving units lined the walls, some bent, some partially collapsed. A few empty containers sat scattered near the far corner, their labels faded beyond recognition. Nothing immediately stood out. Nothing that would explain why this exact spot mattered more than any other part of the building. But Rex had not chosen it randomly. Daniel knew that now. He stepped to the left, then to the right, changing his angle, watching how the light fell across the floor, searching for anything that broke the pattern. And then he saw it. Near the edge of the outline, almost invisible unless you were close enough, there was a small indentation. Not deep, not obvious, but intentional, like something had been pressed down and lifted away, leaving just enough of a mark to say it had once been there. Daniel crouched again, focusing the beam tighter. The indentation formed a partial curve, almost like the corner of a case or a container that had been secured in place. He followed it with his eyes, connecting the faint lines, reconstructing the shape in his mind. A secured evidence box. Standard issue. The kind used for sensitive materials. His pulse did not spike. It narrowed. Focused. Every detail sharpening with quiet precision. If something had been stored here, something important enough to leave a mark after all this time, then the question was not just what it was, but why it was gone. And more importantly, why no one had recorded its removal. Daniel stood again, turning slowly, scanning the rest of the warehouse with a new understanding. This place had not just been abandoned. It had been cleared. Selectively. Intentionally. He walked toward the back wall, his steps measured, counting distance without realizing it, mapping the space in his head. About 20 feet from the entrance. 10 feet from the shelving. The placement was too precise to be random storage. It had been staged. Behind him, Rex rose from his seated position and followed, not close, not distant, maintaining that same quiet alignment as before. When Daniel stopped, Rex stopped. When Daniel turned, Rex adjusted. Not following orders. Matching intent. Daniel paused near a rusted metal beam, running his hand lightly along its surface. The texture was rough, uneven, flakes of oxidation catching against his skin. He brought the flashlight up again, this time angling it higher, scanning along the wall itself. And that was when he noticed the difference. A section of the wall, just a few inches off from the rest, carried a slightly cleaner tone. Faint, barely noticeable, but enough. He stepped closer, narrowing the beam, and the detail became clearer. A rectangular patch. Not painted, not repaired, just less worn. Like something had been mounted there once and later removed. A bracket, a holder, or maybe a panel. Daniel exhaled slowly, the pieces beginning to align in a way that no report had ever described. Whatever had been here was not just placed on the floor. It had been connected to the wall. Secured. Hidden in plain sight. He stepped back slightly, looking between the wall and the floor, tracing the invisible line that connected them. Storage and access. Placement and removal. A system. And then he understood. This had not been a random drop point. It had been a transfer location. Something had been brought here, held here, then taken away under controlled conditions. And Rex had been here when it happened. Daniel turned his head slowly, meeting the dog's gaze again. You saw it, he said quietly. Not a question. A recognition. Rex's ears shifted forward, his stance steady, his eyes holding that same unwavering focus. He had not forgotten. Not for a single day. Daniel felt it then, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet certainty settling into place. The message on the collar had not been a warning. It had been a defense. A statement left behind by someone who knew the truth might be buried. Someone who trusted that one witness would carry it forward, no matter how long it took. Daniel lowered the flashlight slightly, the beam softening as it spread across the floor once more. All right, he said under his breath. Then we find out what they took. And for the first time since they entered the warehouse, Rex took one step forward without waiting, his nose lowering toward the ground, not searching randomly, but following something only he could still sense, a trail that time had tried to erase, but never fully could. Rex moved with a certainty that did not belong to guesswork. His nose hovered just inches above the concrete, tracing a path that no longer existed to the human eye, yet to him it was still there, faint but intact, like a memory etched deeper than time could erase. Daniel followed a step behind, his flashlight angled low, watching the subtle shifts in the dog's posture rather than the ground itself. Each pause, each slight turn of the head, each breath drawn closer to the surface carried meaning. This was not searching. This was remembering. The trail led away from the marked spot on the floor, not toward the main entrance, but toward the far side of the warehouse where the walls grew darker and the air felt heavier, less disturbed by the passage of time. Daniel's boots pressed softly against the dust, leaving fresh impressions over ones that had long since faded, and for a moment, the contrast struck him. One set of steps moving forward, another that had never truly left. Rex slowed as they neared the back corner, his body lowering slightly, not in caution, but in focus, as if the space ahead required more precision. The beam of the flashlight followed, revealing a narrow corridor formed by stacked crates and old metal shelving that leaned just enough to feel unstable but had not yet given in. It was the kind of place most people would ignore, too tight, too cluttered, too unimportant to matter. But Rex stepped into it without hesitation. Daniel paused at the entrance, sweeping the light across the narrow path before stepping in behind him. The air shifted as they moved deeper, cooler, carrying a faint metallic scent that lingered just beneath the dust. Not strong, not fresh, but present. The corridor opened slightly after about 10 feet, just enough to form a small pocket of space between the shelving units. Rex stopped there. This time, he did not sit. He stood still, his head angled toward the ground, his ears forward, his entire posture fixed on a single point. Daniel stepped up beside him, lowering the flashlight carefully. At first, it looked like nothing, just more concrete, more dust. But then, as the light steadied, the difference appeared. A line. Thin. Straight. Too straight to be natural. Daniel crouched, brushing the surface lightly with his fingers. The dust shifted, revealing a faint seam running across the floor, about 3 feet long, perfectly aligned with the wall behind it. A panel, not visible unless you knew where to look. Not marked. Not labeled. Hidden by design. Daniel's breath slowed, his focus narrowing completely now. You stayed on it, he murmured, glancing briefly at Rex. The dog did not move, but his stillness pressed closer, like he had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Daniel ran his fingers along the edge of the seam, feeling for any give. At first, nothing. Then, near the far corner, his hand caught a slight difference in the surface. A notch. Small. Precise. He shifted his grip and pressed down, then pulled gently upward. For a second, the panel resisted, held in place by time and neglect. Then, with a soft, muted sound, it lifted. Not heavy, not locked, just hidden. Daniel set the flashlight down carefully, angling it so the beam fell into the opening. The light revealed a shallow compartment beneath the floor, about a foot deep, its interior lined with a material that had once been clean, now dulled by years of stillness. Empty. At first glance, completely empty. Daniel stared at it, his mind working through the implications. Something had been here. Something important enough to be concealed, to be placed beneath the surface rather than on it. And now, it was gone. He leaned closer, scanning the interior more carefully. The lining was intact. No signs of damage. No disruption. Whatever had been stored here had been removed cleanly. Intentionally. But then he saw it. In the corner of the compartment, barely visible against the dull lining, there was a small object. No larger than a coin. Daniel reached in slowly, his fingers careful as he picked it up and brought it into the light. It was not a coin. It was a key. A small, metallic key with a worn surface and a number etched along one side. Daniel turned it between his fingers, the engraving catching the light just enough to make it readable. The same number from the collar. The same number from the file. His chest tightened slightly, not from surprise, but from confirmation. This was not a coincidence. This was a message, left in pieces, meant to be followed step by someone who would understand what to look for. Daniel closed his hand around the key, holding it firmly for a moment before slipping it into his pocket. He stood slowly, his eyes moving from the open compartment to Rex, who now looked up at him with that same steady gaze. Not expectant, not questioning, just present, like a witness who had done his part and was waiting to see if the rest would be finished. Daniel nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. You kept it safe, he said. The words were simple, but they carried everything that had been proven in that moment. Rex's ears shifted slightly, his posture relaxing just a fraction, not in relief, but in recognition that the path was still moving forward. Daniel replaced the panel carefully, pressing it back into place until it settled flush with the surrounding floor, the seam disappearing once again into the dust. To anyone else, it would look untouched, forgotten, but not to them. Daniel picked up the flashlight and turned toward the exit of the corridor, his mind already moving ahead, connecting the next step before it had even been spoken. A key meant there was something still locked, something still waiting. And whatever it was, it had been important enough for a man to leave behind a message that outlived his own voice, trusting that one day, someone would listen to the only witness who never stopped remembering. The night outside felt quieter when they stepped back into it, as if the warehouse had held its breath while they were inside, and only now released it slowly into the open air. Daniel closed the door behind them without a sound, his hand lingering for a moment on the cold metal before he let it go. In his pocket, the small key rested against the fabric, light in weight, but heavier in meaning than anything he had carried that day. Rex moved beside him, not rushing ahead, not looking back, just keeping pace as they crossed the gravel toward the patrol car. There was no urgency in his steps, but there was direction. Always direction. Daniel opened the rear door again, and this time Rex stepped in without pause, settling into the seat with the same quiet readiness as before. No hesitation. No need for reassurance. Daniel closed the door and took his place behind the wheel, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each action needed to match the significance of what they had uncovered. He did not start the engine right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the key, holding it between his fingers under the soft glow of the dashboard lights. The metal surface reflected faintly, the etched number catching the light just enough to remind him that this was not just a piece of evidence. It was a continuation. He turned it once, then again, studying the shape, the wear along its edges, the slight discoloration that suggested it had been handled often before it was hidden away. Not lost. Hidden. There was a difference. Daniel leaned back slightly in his seat, his eyes drifting to the rearview mirror. Rex was watching him again, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, as if the next step had already been decided long before Daniel had even found the key. "Where does it go?" Daniel asked quietly. The question was not directed at the dog alone. It was directed at everything that had been left behind. Rex did not move, but his ears shifted just slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that did not answer the question, but did not deny it either. Daniel exhaled slowly and turned his attention back to the phone in his hand. He reopened the file, scrolling past the sections he had already read, searching now with a different purpose. Not for what had been written, for what had been missed. His thumb paused over a section labeled Evidence Handling, a list of items processed during the investigation. Most were standard, logged, accounted for, closed. But near the bottom, there was a line that stood out, not because of what it said, but because of how little it said. Item 7, Secured Transfer. Location withheld. Daniel frowned slightly, reading it again. Location withheld. Not undisclosed. Not unknown. Withheld. That meant someone had made a decision to keep it from the record. Intentionally. His eyes moved to the reference number beside it. It matched the number on the key. Daniel felt the connection settle into place with quiet certainty. This was it. The missing piece had not disappeared. It had been moved. And the key was the only way back to it. He tapped the screen again, pulling up the reference index tied to the evidence log. The system took a second longer to respond this time, as if accessing something buried deeper, something not meant to be reached easily. Then, slowly, a new entry appeared. Storage designation. Facility code. A location just outside the city, but not the same one they had just left. Different sector. Official. Controlled. Daniel studied it for a moment, committing the details to memory before closing the file. He slipped the phone back into his jacket and looked at the key one last time before returning it to his pocket. "You knew," he said softly, his voice carrying a quiet respect now. Not just for the dog, but for the man who had left the trail behind. Rex's gaze did not change, but something in his posture softened, just slightly, like the weight he had been carrying had shifted, even if only by a fraction. Daniel started the engine, the low hum filling the space again, steady and grounding. The headlights cut through the darkness as he turned the car back toward the main road, the gravel giving way to pavement once more. The route ahead was different now. Not uncertain. Not guessed. Defined. As they drove, The city lights began to reappear in the distance, faint at first, then growing stronger with each passing mile. But Daniel did not focus on them. His attention stayed forward, on the path that had been laid out piece by piece, step by step, by someone who had known he might not be there to finish it himself. The silence in the car was not empty. It was filled with understanding, with purpose, with the quiet agreement between a man and a dog that neither of them had spoken out loud. Behind him, Rex shifted slightly for the first time since they had left the warehouse. Not restless, not uneasy, just adjusting, as if preparing for what came next. Daniel caught the movement in the mirror and nodded once, a small gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could. "We are not done," he said. And the road ahead, stretching under the dim glow of streetlights and the quiet hum of the engine, seemed to answer in the only way it could, by continuing forward. The facility did not look like something that held secrets. It stood clean, quiet, and official, a low concrete structure surrounded by a chain-link fence and a single entry gate that reflected the glow of overhead security lights. Everything about it suggested order, procedure, finality. Daniel slowed the patrol car as he approached, his eyes scanning the perimeter, noting the cameras, the controlled access point, the absence of anything out of place. This was where things were stored when they were meant to be forgotten properly. Logged, locked, filed away under layers of protocol that discouraged questions more than they prevented them. He parked just outside the gate and turned off the engine, the sudden silence settling over them once again. For a moment, he did not move. His hand rested over his pocket where the key remained, the shape of it now familiar, like something that had always been there waiting to be used. In the rearview mirror, Rex met his gaze, calm as ever, but there was something different now. Not tension, not anticipation. Completion, maybe. Or the quiet understanding that they had reached the final step of something that had begun long before either of them had stood in this place. Daniel stepped out of the car and moved toward the access panel beside the gate. A keypad, a small slot beneath it. Standard design. He entered his credentials, the system responding with a soft tone, granting him limited entry. The gate unlocked with a muted click. Official access would get him inside, but it would not get him everything. That part required something else. He walked back to the car and opened the rear door. Rex stepped out without being asked, his posture steady, his eyes already scanning the facility as if he recognized it not from sight, but from purpose. Together, they moved through the gate, the metal closing behind them with a quiet finality that echoed slightly in the still air. Inside, the building was even more controlled. Clean floors, white walls, fluorescent lights that did not flicker, did not fade, did not allow shadows to linger. Rows of secured storage units lined the interior, each labeled, each accounted for, each one holding something that had been deemed important enough to keep, but not important enough to revisit. Daniel walked past them slowly, his steps measured, his eyes moving across the labels without stopping. He did not need to search randomly. The number in his pocket had already told him where to go. He stopped at the end of the row, where a smaller unit sat slightly apart from the others. No special markings. No indication that it held anything different. Just a lock. Waiting. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the key, holding it for a moment before bringing it to the slot. His hand did not shake. It did not hesitate. But there was weight in the movement, the kind that comes when you know something is about to change, not just in the world around you, but in the way things will be remembered. The key slid in smoothly. He turned it once. A soft click followed. Then another. The lock released. Daniel paused for a brief second, then pulled the door open. Inside, there was a single container. Smaller than expected. Clean. Sealed. Labeled only with the same reference number that had led them here. No description. No summary. Just a number that had been passed from one place to another without explanation. Daniel stepped closer and placed his hand on the container, feeling the cool surface beneath his palm. He opened it slowly. Inside, the contents were simple. A file, a recording device, and a folded piece of paper. Nothing dramatic, nothing overwhelming, just quiet evidence. The kind that speaks when someone finally listens. Daniel picked up the paper first, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, familiar in a way that did not require introduction. A statement. Not long, not complicated, but clear. A record of what had happened, of what had not happened, of what had been misunderstood. He read it once, then again, each word settling deeper than the last. There was no anger in it, no desperation, just truth, left behind by someone who had known he might not be there to explain it himself. Daniel lowered the paper slowly, his eyes moving to the recording device. He did not play it right away. He did not need to. The story was already complete in the way that mattered. The rest would only confirm what had never stopped being true. Behind him, Rex stood quietly, his presence steady, his gaze not on the container, but on Daniel. Not asking, not waiting, just there. Daniel closed the container gently, his hand resting on it for a moment before stepping back. He reached into his pocket again and removed the collar, the worn leather catching the light just enough to show the engraving that had started all of this. He looked at it, then at Rex, then back at the container. "You kept your promise," he said softly. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Rex's ears shifted slightly, his posture easing just a fraction, not in relief, but in recognition. The weight had been carried.